All right, so this week's we're getting exposed to international relations, and we're looking at different theories and different approaches to international relations. Um, and of course, one of the central concerns of international relations theory is the problem of power, right? Because we were talking about, or I mentioned this in the course overview for this week that that we live in an anarchic international environment. And the question is, these power considerations. What is power? And certainly, at its heart, power is some kind of coercion. Power is uh, the ability to make people do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. The question there is, is power always about violence? Clearly, it's not. Sometimes power is about, persuasion. Sometimes it's about bribery. Sometimes it is about threats. So it's a very complicated set of considerations when you're talking about power. We want to talk about some of the core assumptions of classical realism. Who are some of the classical realists? Obviously, we're talking about people like Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hans Morgenthau in the 20th century is considered sort of a classic, realist. What are their considerations? And one of the central, concerns that they have is, how can a state sustain itself in the international environment? What kinds of considerations have to be, undertaken? Certainly, when you look at Machiavelli, he says of the prince must appear to be, moral, must appear to be constrained by morality. But the prince must also be, trained. Their mind must be trained in such a way that when they have to set moral considerations aside and do what is best for the state, even if that is something that would be abhorrent to them individually, that they have to be prepared to do that. Um, I think the author spent a good deal of time talking about the difference between classical realism and structural realism. I don't necessarily want you guys to get too deeply into the weeds on that. I think that there are certainly things to learn, but I'm not necessarily gonna kill you guys testing you on that sort of stuff. I think the theory and practice section from part three, where it talks about the Rwandan genocide, is very interesting and something that we probably should talk, that we should talk about that sort of thing. The text talks quite a bit about liberalism. What does liberalism mean in international relations theory? And certainly there are lots of neoliberals out there that have fairly realistic perceptions of the world. They understand the nature of power pretty well and are not afraid to use power. Liberals have a tendency, though, to think that cooperation and the prospect for cooperation within international relations is greater than realists are prepared to admit. Um, and then we'll talk a good bit about radicalism, various kinds of radicalism. What kinds of explanations for global poverty are there, and to no small extent, realists, or I mean, Marxists and dependency theorists and neo-Marxists all agree that exploitation plays a very important role in that. And when you look outside of the United States and Western Europe, what you will find in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia, and certainly in Central and Southeast Asia, or West Asia, I should say, that dependency theory has a real audience. These folks are persuaded that they are being exploited and that the exploiters are the nations and the corporations of the West. And so how do you interact with those folks if you're an international corporation and you want to go into, Nigeria and drill for oil, or Africa generally and drill for oil, when you know that a lot of these folks are looking at you with kind of a cynical eye and think, that you are not out for their best good. You're just out for money. So there's a ton of things to talk about this week, and if you have anything that you find confusing, please don't hesitate to ask in the forum.